Father, the rest of these verses won't make sense to us. The rest of what James is saying here flows out of that, in that everything God does is because of his love for us. He isn't stingy, he isn't miserly, he isn't selfish, he's lavish, he's generous. You guys are probably wondering what this picture is all about. So this was back in April. Florence and I were together in Dover. Christy, I'm not sure where she was at, but I went past the golden arches of McDonald's, and as I'm going past, I'm like, you know what? I think it's time for Florence's first Happy Meal. So I whip the Rav around and go back and pull into McDonald's, and anyways, I ordered her first Happy Meal. She remembers it. She's pointing at it. What do you guys think is in this box, in this Happy Meal box? Any thoughts? What's in this box? What's that? Poison. Okay, it's harsh, but yeah, probably true. Anyone else? Chicken nuggets, fries, and a toy. Yeah, and apple slices to sort of balance out the the grease. What if I told you that there was rocks in there, or a snake? You guys would probably think that I'm a crazy person, or that I'm a cruel dad. And James actually, I think he gets this from Jesus in Matthew 7 through 11. Turn to that, actually. I'm just going to go ahead and read that. Jesus says, "Ask and it will be given you. Seek and you will find. Knock and it will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, and the one who seeks finds, and to the one who knocks it will be opened. Or which of you, if his son asks him for chicken nuggets, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for french fries, will give him a serpent? If you then, who are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give good things to those who ask him?" Now, I obviously substituted some words there, but you guys get my point in that I'm an earthly dad. I make mistakes, but I love Florence. I love her like crazy, and I want to give her good things. You guys, some of you might argue that this isn't a good thing. I thought it was, and she did too. So, but my point is that God is that way to us. He's a father who loves his children. And if we can understand that, if we can understand this idea that God is a generous God who wants to give us good things, then the rest of what James is saying will make sense. It's from this idea of God's generosity that the rest of these verses flow out of. My second observation from verses 5 through 8 are that God gives wisdom to believers who face trials. He says, "If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God." So, in the first part of chapter 1, we saw that we're going to face trials. It's inevitable. We're going to face trials, but we can face them with joy because we know that God is bringing about spiritual maturity. God uses trials to perfect our faith. But along with this joy that we can have, God also gives us wisdom to know how to live in the middle of those trials. So why wisdom? Why didn't God say, if you lack strength, or if you lack ability, or if you lack money, let him ask of God? He says, if you lack wisdom, let him ask of God. I think while God uses trials to bring about maturity in our lives, trials also have the potential to destroy our faith. So just this past week, a young local man was laid to rest after pretty tragic drowning accident. Many of you guys, I'm sure, have heard about that or know about it. And he left behind a wife, a child, family, friends. And right now, I'm sure they're asking a lot of questions. They're asking, God, why did you allow this to happen? Why was such a young life taken? How do we move on from this loss? Will life ever feel normal again? And the truth is that they desperately need God's wisdom right now. They don't need money. They need wisdom to know, how do we move on? How do we live life and remain faithful? Because trials have the potential to destroy our faith. And that's why we need wisdom. Wisdom is a gift that God gives to us when we're facing trials. So this idea of wisdom, I want to look at that a little bit. What is wisdom? What does he mean by wisdom here? So wisdom doesn't mean smart or like intellectually gifted. It doesn't mean somebody with a high IQ. It doesn't even mean just like knowing a lot about the Bible. But I think his idea here of wisdom is that wisdom is understanding how God views the world and understanding how to live life in God's ways. It's not simply knowing something in your head, but actually but having a readiness to live out God's truth in real life. This is the wisdom that God promises. So Douglas Moo, he says, wisdom is the means by which the godly can both discern and carry out the will of God. And here you can see Proverbs' influence on James's understanding of wisdom. His audience would have definitely been familiar with these next verses that I want to read. Go ahead and turn to Proverbs 2, 6 through 15. Why don't you all stand, and those of you who have the ESV version, let's read these verses together out loud. Proverbs 2, 6 through 15. When James talks about God giving wisdom, this is the type of wisdom that he's talking about. Proverbs 2, 6 through 15. Let's read it together. For the Lord gives wisdom. From his mouth come knowledge and understanding. He stores up sound wisdom for the upright. He is a shield to those who walk in integrity, guarding the paths of justice and watching over the way of his saints. Then you will understand righteousness and justice and equity, every good path. For wisdom will come into your heart, and knowledge will be pleasant to your soul. Discretion will watch over you, and understanding will guard you, delivering you from the way of evil, from men of perverted speech, who forsake the paths of uprightness, who walk in the ways of darkness, who rejoice in doing evil and delight in the perverseness of evil, men whose paths are crooked and who are devious in their ways. Thank you. You guys can be seated. So just remember James's audience is, many of them are familiar with the Old Testament. They're familiar with the wisdom of the Old Testament. When he talks about wisdom here, this is the type of wisdom he's talking about. God gives wisdom to believers who face trials. Proverbs 3 through 8 say, let not steadfast love and faithfulness forsake you. Bind them around your neck. Write them on the tablet of your heart, so you will find favor and good success in the sight of God and man. And he says, trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your paths straight. So this idea of wisdom being more than just something that I know in my head, like a head knowledge. It's actually a knowing what God thinks about the world and then having a willingness and a readiness to live that out in everyday life. And James actually, he goes on later in chapter 3, he talks about this wisdom. James chapter 3, verses 13, and then jumping down to 17. Who is wise and understanding among you? By his good conduct, let him show his works in the meekness of wisdom. Going down to 17, he says, but the wisdom that comes from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere. So it's this wisdom that God gives to believers facing trials. A wisdom to understand God's ways and to live out God's ways in the middle of trial, middle of hardship, middle of pain and loss. It's this wisdom that sustains faith when hardship comes. God gives wisdom to believers who face trials. My third point is, to receive wisdom, we must ask with committed faith. So he says, God promises, or he says, if you lack wisdom, let him ask of God. He says, but let him ask in faith with no doubting. So he promises to give wisdom to those who ask in faith. Now, what does he mean by faith? What does he like? How do I know if I have enough faith, or what this faith is? What does he mean by this? I think some of us understand these verses to mean that if I just have enough, if I have enough belief in my heart, if I can somehow conjure up enough mental belief, that God will give this to me. But faith is so much more than just what I can come up with in my head as far as what I believe. And Mose, actually, thank you for sharing what you did this morning in Sunday school class. It was just I was just cheering to myself a little bit inwardly. So I was like, yes, that's exactly what I want to cover. And that's what James means when he says, let him ask in faith. We're going to see at a later time then where James talks about this faith. Faith that is demonstrated by action. For James, faith is not only about believing the right things. It's actually about living out those beliefs. In chapter 2, he says, for as the body without the spirit is dead, so also faith apart from works is dead. So this is a belief. This faith, it's a belief. It starts with a belief in God's provision, but it's also demonstrated by commitment to live out those beliefs, to live out God's leading. It's a resolve to follow through on what we believe. And I think this if we would read it in this way, and this is the RGV, the Randy Garcete version. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given him. But let him ask in committed faith, or like Mose said this morning, faithfulness. That word faith can actually is at different times in Scripture can be translated faithfulness or faithful. Let him ask in faithfulness with a committed heart, so that before he's even asking God, that his heart is committed, that he's asking out of a heart of faithfulness. And he contrasts, in the next section, faith and doubt. He talks about how we ask. We can ask in faith, or we can ask in doubt. And that is what he means when he talks about faith. It's a faithful, it's a committed faith, it's a faithfulness to act out what God is saying in his word and in the wisdom that he gives. So this picture, can you guys see it? Okay, might be a little blurry. This is Hiro Onada. He was a Japanese soldier in World War II. How many of you guys have seen this picture or I've heard this story? It's a fairly common story, but it captures this idea of a committed faith in a way that, I just love this story. He was a Japanese soldier. He was fighting in the Philippines, and after World War II ended, I'm not sure if him and his friends never heard about it. They were in the middle of the jungle in some Philippine island. They never hear about the end of the war, and as time goes on, they're still in the jungle, and they end up never surrendering until 1974. So about 29 years after the war had ended. They ended up killing, I think, over 30 people in surrounding villages and stuff. He had such a committed faith to the cause of Japan that nothing anybody told him about the war being over could dissuade him. He was absolutely committed, absolutely loyal, to the point of killing 30 people in the surrounding villages. It ended up taking the Emperor of Japan in 1974 to come to the Philippines and formally give him his terms of surrender and tell him it's okay, the war's over. And he, as he went back to Japan, then he said, I am embarrassed, but I have returned. So this idea of a committed faith is what James is talking about. A faith that doesn't just believe that we don't just believe it in our heads. We live it out. And he says, with this faithfulness, ask me for wisdom. You're going to go through trials. But ask me, and like a generous father, I want to give you wisdom. But ask with this type of committed faith. A faith that seeks to act out when God leads and when God directs. So we talked a little bit about faith and what that word means. And James goes on to contrast asking in faith with asking in doubt. And this is my fourth point, is that the double-minded person should not expect God to answer his requests. And that sounds sort of harsh, but we'll explore this a little bit more. He says, if you lack wisdom, verse 6, he says, but let him ask in faith with no doubting, for the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. Let him ask with no doubting. This word doubting in Greek can actually mean wavering. How many of you guys have the King James Version this morning? Okay. Perfect. Okay, so in the King James says, let him ask in faith, nothing wavering, for he that wavereth is like a wave of the sea driven by the wind and tossed. I think doubting, the translation here in the ESV at least, where it says ask with no doubting, can be a little bit confusing, because it almost makes some of us think that, well, if we even have a thought come through our minds, that a question that we might have about, is God really there, or does he understand what I'm going through, that's doubt. And what James is saying here is that that word doubt is more than that. It's a wavering, or it's a hesitating. It's a divided heart. It's somebody who's not committed, somebody who's indecisive, or is unwilling to follow God's ways when it requires sacrifice. Somebody who tries to serve both God and self. He that wavereth is like a wave of the sea, driven by the wind and tossed. And he goes on to say, he is double-minded, unstable in all his ways. And double-minded in Greek literally means, if you take the literal wording, it means two-souled. Or having, two-souled. And I love that the way that is put there. He says, "Let not that man think that he shall receive anything from the Lord." When I was younger, when I was a teenager, I was introduced to pornography, and I struggled for years to overcome that sinful habit. I would cry out to God for wisdom, Lord, just ask Him to save me from this sin. But at the time, I also had some friends who when we get together, we'd watch R-rated movies or ungodly TV shows that were full of sensuality, immorality, and at the same, this is happening at the same time that I'm desperately wanting to overcome this addiction of pornography, and I think that's what he's talking about. I was double-minded. I was double-minded. On the one hand, I wanted freedom, but on the other hand, I wasn't willing to give up patterns or a lifestyle that was going after sin. And in that, he says that person is unstable. He's double-minded. He's indecisive. He's unwilling to sacrifice things that God requires to find freedom. Last Saturday, I had the privilege of going fishing with my dad and a couple other people to Lake Erie. So we get up like some ungodly hour of the morning. I think it was like 2 o'clock maybe, and I'm not a big fisherman to start with. I enjoy fishing, but I'm not an avid fisherman. We get up to the lake around 5 in the morning. I'm crusty-eyed. I haven't slept well. I haven't eaten much, and so we launch our boat out by the dock, and earlier we'd stopped by a little tackle shop to get some stuff, and the tackle shop owner was fairly concerned about the waves. He said, they're going to be pretty bad out there this morning. So we launch our boat and sort of ease our way out of the Edgewater harbor, the relative safely of the Edgewater docking area there, and so we get out, and the water is rough. It's like 4 and 5 foot waves, and I am sore afraid. Our boat like pitches and rolls and rocks back and forth in the waves, and there's like not many people parked at the parking lot, and we're just like sort of easing our way out into these rough waters, and I'm thinking to myself, Lord Jesus, if you will but let me see my wife and daughter again, I will be ever grateful. Thankfully, we had a good motor, a good boat, a good captain, a good GPS system who knew exactly where we needed to go and took us right where we needed to go. Now, if we didn't have a good motor, if our motor gave out, if we didn't know where we wanted to go, we would have bobbed around in the middle of Lake Erie. We would have drifted down the coast a couple miles, or even worse, Canada. I think this is a perfect picture of what the double-minded man is like, what the life of the double-minded man is like. He's carried about by the waves of life. He has no driving commitment to cut through the waves to where God is leading. He's basically at the mercy of life's waves. James says, "For that person must not suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord." So this morning, are you a double-minded man, or are you a faithful follower with committed faith? So, to the double-minded man, I have some words for us. Some of you guys might be here this morning, and you identify more with the man with who's double-minded. You're not committed. You're, on the one hand, you say you want to follow Jesus, and you're trying to chase after Jesus, but at the same time, there's a small part of your life that you're not willing to commit to him. You're uncommitted, you're undecisive. And to you, I would say, turn from your unstable ways to Christ Jesus, the immovable rock. I've been there, and some of us know what that life is like. You feel like this guy right here. They go deep sea fishing, they said. It would be fun, they said. You can see he's seasick, he's, nauseous. Can't see it? Okay. It's a meme of a guy who's seasick. Anyways, you feel like him this morning, and you're tired of being undecided, undecisive, uncommitted. And to you, I say, turn from your unstable ways to Christ, who's a solid, immovable rock. Matthew 7, 24 through 27 says, "Therefore everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them may be compared to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against that house, and yet it did not fall, for it had been founded on the rock. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against that house, and it fell, and great was its fall." Ephesians 4:13 through 14. "Until we all attain to the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, to mature manhood, to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ." And listen to this right here. "So that we may no longer be children, tossed to and fro by the waves and carried about by every wind of doctrine, by human cunning, by craftiness and deceitful schemes." Maybe you're here this morning, you've never decided to follow Jesus. I think we take it for granted sometimes that we've all decided to follow Jesus. But if you're here this morning, if you've never made a commitment to turn from your sinful ways and to follow Jesus with your life, I would invite you to do so. There is chasing sin, chasing after the world will leave you feeling seasick. You'll be unstable in all your ways. In Christ there is life. Psalms 4:42. "He brought me up out of the pit of destruction, out of the miry clay, and he set my feet upon a rock, making my footsteps firm." All right, so I had some words for the double-minded person. To the one with committed faith. Maybe you're here this morning and you're going through something really tough. I don't know what you guys all go through throughout the week, but I know there's some of you here who are going through difficult things. James says that we can ask for God's wisdom. So that's the first step you need to take, is to ask. Ask God for wisdom, and ask with the expectation that he will answer your prayer. He promises to do so, and he's a generous father who wants to bless his children. And then act. Commit to act on what God reveals to you. It says to ask in faith, in faithfulness, with a commitment to act out on what God leads, on the wisdom that he gives. That is all I had this morning, and I hope that you guys have a great week, and that God continues to lead us all. So why don't we all... Actually, I'll turn the time over to Sean.